Misconceptions. So I'm thinking specifically here about not necessarily things that kids make silly mistakes with. It's things that they think they've understood and they haven't. So they think they've understood, but they've understood wrong. And this kind of there are a few directions of this in economics, and it's perhaps less clear than in some other subjects. But things like a price change leads to a shift in demand or supply, kind of those fundamental things. And so we just think at the start, just thinking about what the sort of ones that come up and how we might deal with them. In some cases, how we deal with them is specific to the misconception itself. But there are some perhaps general things that help with misconceptions that you can use with misconceptions more generally. So firstly, things that people think they understand and they don't. And then there's also the things that people confuse. So it might be that they understood it once, but they're remembering incorrectly. And we'll kind of class that as a misconception as well. So I'm going to get ball rolling with price change leads to a shift in demand or supply. Has anyone had any experience with that? Or is that just my students? And how do you get around that in the classroom? I think Marginal Revolutions University have just, which I read quite like the MRU stuff, but they've come up with there's like a little game on their website where you have to, it's a shift or a slide, and you kind of have to do that with it, and find that quite good. I generally explain it as like, these are the conditions of demand, and if the conditions of demand change, then you have to change the curve. If the conditions of demand aren't changing, then you don't need to change the curve. But it's quite difficult to explain that it's already baked into the curve, that a price change is already being shown in that. Has anyone got any ways that they get around that? Is it just lots of practice? Any thoughts? Go on, Andrew.
Well, I'm not sure the answer is that, apart from lots of practice. I just wanted to chip in and say my personal bugbear is the sort of almost the exact parallel of that in macro, where you sometimes get people saying, okay, here's this shift in aggregate demand for whatever reason. Oh, and that causes some inflation, which means that people have got less disposable income or something, so they stop spending, so consumption falls, so aggregate demand falls again. And it's like, it's already, again, the price level thing was already baked into that, and the aggregate demand as being a variable mix of all those components, different price levels, I think they find really hard. So yeah, similar ideas, but on the macro side.
Do you think spending a while looking at plotting demand curves and aggregate demand curves is useful in that? In overcoming it, do you think, Manisha?
So I was going to then ask the question to you of how long do you spend doing that? Because I feel like I spend ages drawing the diagrams and explaining to them how to draw them and so I think I spend longer than normal. But I'm now just curious how long everyone else spends plotting the graphs. And I guess the same with cost and revenue graphs as well.
I mean, my answer to that is I'm pretty quick, and I normally do it on the board, because even as a maths teacher, my bugbear is students just can't draw axes. They can't draw axes. They can't plot graphs. It's absolute hell trying to watch them. So I tend to do it on the board. But maybe that's why there's a slight problem there. And Manisha, I'm really sorry, but the reason why I didn't see your hand up before is I thought you had this weird hand decor on your wall. I was like, that's a strange choice.
That's a door. That's a door.
No, when your hand was up, when your hand's up, it has a little symbol in the corner. Anyway. So is there any other answers to that? How long do you spend actually plotting the demand curve or the aggregate demand curve in the first instance? No thoughts? I also try to, because they've just learnt ceteris paribus by then. So sometimes I say, you've drawn this curve under these circumstances where we've got, a certain time, a certain season, a certain population level, a certain prices of complement substitutes, all that stuff. And I go through and say, we're plotting it under these circumstances. But if our assumptions change, then we have to draw the new curve. But then students sometimes get so confused because they say, well, the price is a consumption. Any other thoughts on that before I move on to some different misconceptions? Any other misconceptions that you guys particularly want to discuss? I did come up with a list, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Okay, so the next one on my list is that inferior goods are cheaper than luxury goods, which is another one that kids sometimes get, that it's a cheaper version, therefore it must be inferior. I like an always, sometimes, never type activity with that, because of course things like lecky cards are way more expensive per unit of electricity than a bill is. Is there anything like that you've come across, or any other examples that you use to kind of disprove that? Do you use examples to disprove it, or is that, is there another kind of way?
I think the wider thing there is I find they struggle with the concept of like relative price changes are the important thing. So, product A becomes cheaper than product B. It might still product A becomes cheaper, and they seem to want to put it into it is absolutely cheaper than product B, and therefore they will buy more of product A, as opposed to it might still be more expensive, but it's now cheaper than it was, and therefore is relatively better, and so on. And that's the sort of wider class of error, I think, possibly.
And that also leads to difficulties with elasticity along the demand curve.
Yeah.
They don't understand why we're adding £1 each time and it's not changing. It's that kind of, it's a proportional, relational kind of understanding. Again, are there any ways of getting around that other than saying, look, this is literally a 50% increase? If the price of matches goes up from 20p to 40p, it has doubled in price, but we probably wouldn't notice if we were at the supermarket. Any ways that you guys get around that kind of thing? Okay, the next one I've got is more money leads to, if people have higher incomes, they have a higher MPC. That one you get a lot. Any responses, any ideas? I don't know. Everyone's very quiet tonight. I'll just keep going. I'll keep going through my list.
Sorry, Isabel. I think that's one. I completely agree with that. Comes up all the time, particularly with year 12 economists when they first encounter it. I think it's just, from my perspective, loads and loads of different examples where someone receives more income, but actually their NPC stays the same, and it's just showing them. I think someone talked about last time on here about variation theory, and just kind of showing them an example where the income changes, but actually the amount their NPC doesn't change. It's just the amount they are spending changes because of the higher income. And
so showing that this has stayed the same, this is different.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very small differences there.
Exactly.
I think lots of my students know it because we often use it as because it's a nice, easy evaluation criticism of it's an easy justification for redistribution. I think why a lot of my students get it in the end, because we come back to it so much because it's such an easy one. It's an easy one to teach. Any other?
I don't find that one so common, but then I think that because that's possibly because I don't tend to emphasize MPC quite as much, possibly, or something, or I only use it in those evaluative ways. I honestly don't encounter too much of them going through a stage of talking. Why do you need to go there to change the MPs? Why do you need to say that?
I would say it's when they're learning to use the circular flow. I don't find that the problem afterwards is when they're learning to use the circular flow, it's getting confused between, and actually it's a general thing, they're getting confused between the marginal and the rate. So the rate and the marginal and the level is all really, really difficult for them. So you find that your students don't tend to get to that stage?
Yeah, I guess not. Or they don't. I'm struggling to think of when I would have put forward go through that stage of that analysis to mention it. So yeah, somebody's income goes up, more spending. It will depend upon MPC, sure, but
yeah.
I'm not quite sure.
I think for me,
it's just the emphasis that I've put on it, possibly.
Sorry, my dog's having a conversation with the dog outside. But for me, it's when they're thinking into circular flow, or say that they, so if it's also be like that, if they've got more money, then their propensity to report does go up. But it's thinking about the stuff going around, and they think that if there's more money, then they're going to spend more of that money, when actually they're likely to spend less of whatever they've got. That's a tricky one. In a similar one, which is, and it's really easy to understand why students have this one, but imports as an injection and exports as a withdrawal. And it's really easy to understand why they have that. I just tend to say it's the circular flow of income. It's the income that's moving, not the goods. But yeah, I think that's a tricky one. I do really like an always, sometimes never activity for misconceptions, because I think it's a really good way of drawing them out. So giving them a load of statements, and they have to work out which ones are always true, which ones are can't be true and which ones can, are sometimes true. The problem is that generally a lot of them, like 90% of them, are going to be sometimes, and also some students really, really, really struggle with that, and they end up more confused than they were to start with. In general, I think with misconceptions, shining a light on them and bringing the misconceptions out into the open is the way to go. But sometimes I wonder whether putting the idea in their head is a problem. Once you've said don't say this, then whether they then think about that more. I don't know.
I've got another one to add, which is related and similar in a way. Not exactly a misconception, but an unnecessary overuse. I find often students are desperate to say, people's incomes have fallen, and therefore confidence is low, and therefore they spend less. No, their incomes are less. That's enough. That's all you needed. The confidence is an extra thing about predictions about the future and stuff. You don't need to go to confidence. And they as soon as you tell them about confidence, they seem to sort of jump on that all the time in an unnecessary fashion, I find.
There are a number of either oversimplifications or kind of misguided conclusions that students will very often come to, and often annoyingly, it's these kinds of conclusions that they come to that they really then stick with, and they write paragraph after paragraph about it, and these really short, sure language. Don't use cautious language. It will cause this, and that will inevitably cause that. So things in that category I've got are that that new technology destroys jobs or creates jobs. They don't tend to see the shade in that. I guess that's just discussion that we get through that. Gavin said that he reads wrong example. Gavin has read that wrong examples were a good idea when showing examples, but then read recently that it can confuse them. It is a tricky one. Perhaps kind of the true or false things, and really, really making it clear. And actually, a lot of the multiple choice questions can help with this as well. We've mentioned before about diagnostic questions, which is basically just a multiple choice question where each answer relates to each wrong answer is the result of a misconception, which helps you to identify the specific misconceptions that students have. I think they're perhaps not as useful in economics, because often once the right answer is there, it's easy for students to work to see that it's right. But it's more that without any prompts, they don't automatically go to the right answer, if you see what I mean. Often they're not so strong in their belief that they're right that they would, when they see it, it makes sense to them that that's the right answer. So I don't think they always work in economics, but I think that there is some benefit. What else have I got? Just diminishing, for example, diminishing marginal productivity or diminishing marginal utility. Actually, to be fair, marginal anything is fraught with difficulties and students misunderstand, but particularly thinking that it's going to go down rather than it's going to go, that it's just going to slow, but that it's going to add. I mean, marginal concepts are incredibly important in economics, and it's how we explain that. I think often they understand when you explain, but then they forget it for the next time. So you're saying that you're adding less each time. But has anyone got anything really useful that they use for that? Perhaps examples, I don't know, does people use the kind of chocolate bar type examples, or do you plot it? Got any?
We use chocolate. I use chocolate. Always.
Live experiment.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because one of my year 12 said to me at Easter, he was like, "Oh, I still remember that lesson." I'm like, "Thank you. Do you remember what you learned?" Yeah, just about. But yeah, I use chocolate and the diminishing marginal utility. But then I also use 2 as a comparison. Yeah, it works. It works all right.
And do you plot it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So they whiteboard on their table how they feel at the end, and then we do like a whole whiteboard of everyone, so they can't actually see what each other think at the end of every 5 chocolate buttons or whatever I'm using, and then we plot it right at the end. So they normally take a photo of it, that kind of thing, and then we'll use it for the next lesson.
I'm impressed that you let the kids eat the chocolate. I would just be standing at the front of the scoffing one bar. I now feel happy and have another. I now feel happier but less happy. A lot of the difficulties surround definitions, and part of that is because sometimes the way that we word things in economics is just unnecessarily difficult. So consumer surplus versus surplus. Students get really, really confused about that. And for very close similar words, I like using Venn diagrams, what's actually similar about the word and what's actually similar about the concept and what's different. Another one that they think that unemployment is, they think that it's everybody who's not employed. I find a flow chart there works well. So actually a lot of the things that I'm saying I find useful are kind of quite visual ways of doing it. Gavin says he ate bananas when he was at school. It was healthier back then. Very good. What else have we got? The World Bank lends money. Shutdown points. They think if revenue is less than cost, they shut down. Again, that's not wrong necessarily, but it's just it's the overconfident conclusions, and they're not seeing the grey area. And the meaning of investment is definitely one. I think there are a couple of categories coming up here. There's a kind of couple of real conceptual things, and I think they're the really interesting ones, like the thing about marginality and the curves not shifting. But I wonder whether the answer is, as Manisha said, to just spend more time actually plotting the data so that you see the differences. But then there are these kind of definitions kind of issues, current account deficit versus budget deficit, profit, supernormal profit, deflation, disinflation. How do you help students to get around those tricky kind of the confusing terms that are easily confused? Is it just a case of learning, testing, or is there, do we need something else? Do we need something more to help show the difference between those?
I don't do anything in particular on some of these. I just as long as you highlight whenever they come up in whatever format, just be really rigorous and say no, that's wrong for this reason, and take all those opportunities. But apart from that, I'm probably a bit slack and lazy in actually heading some of these off in the first place. Apart from just trying my best to give the precise definitions and make everything in a logical order and blah blah blah, things we talked about before. But ways to deal with lots of these, I'm not entirely sure. Yeah,
so I think that kind of what that kind of leads to is that there's almost like three levels of intervention here. There's the making sure that those errors don't occur in the first place by, for example, structuring our curriculum in a sensible order, etc., etc. There's the being very aware that when they come up, when you teach them, being explicit about the confusions. So when you teach it, say, this is what we're doing, it's not this. And then there's the picking it up when it comes, picking it up when it recurs, and spotting it when it happens. So I guess I don't know. It seems like a three level approach. Gavin's saying classic mistake, klaxon. Yeah, I used to have someone gave me a QI board game for Christmas, which I never played, but it did have the kind of the klaxon sound on it. Yeah, exactly. I don't know where that is. Wealth of income. I think demerit goods is an interesting one, because the definition of demerit goods is defined differently between the syllabuses. And actually, I mean, I learned demerit goods as a form of information failure. But I read a couple of years ago that the guy that actually first used the term has said since that actually it's not particularly well-defined term, and it's used in lots of different ways. So in the Edexcel syllabus, it's used explicitly as an information failure term in that people believe that it's better for them than it is, and vice versa. Whereas in the AQA spec, it's down as it could be it could be anything. It could be a negative externality. It could be information failure. It could be any of those. So that's one that is slightly difficult, because then I now have to teach it is we're going to take it as meaning this. You'll see that some people say that it means this, but for the purposes of your exam, it means this. Galaxy M31. Going back on diminishing marginals, kids like, Roald Dahl, Matilda and the chocolate cake. Love that clip. And end of section tests, I do previous topics, common errors, questions at the start of the next test. So you do a test, you see what the common errors were, and then go back over them. That's a good shout. And then there's some general fallacies, but I think they're perhaps easier they're easier to get around. So the strategies there, we've basically said, are the prevention in the first place through very careful curriculum, and then there's bringing them into daylight either by just saying that they're different or I think the activities I tend to use are Venn diagrams and or sometimes never, but I think used with caution, because then it does get into a quite conceptual, like, can the multiplier be more than be negative and all that stuff. And then just lots and lots of recall and picking it up, I guess. Yeah. Okay. Any more to say on misconceptions, misunderstandings? Not necessarily common errors, but
there was a nice question format in the old OCR papers that was distinguished between X and Y, when X and Y are two relatively easily to confuse concepts. So I wheel that out on occasion. So there was a question in an exam, distinguish between deficit and debt, public deficit, public debt, and 4 marks I think they were worth. So you sort of had to say that these things are, you basically had to say these things are related for these reasons. This is their relationship, but this is why they're not actually the same thing, and be precise about your definition. So I use that sort of question.
That's kind of like similarities and differences as well.
Yeah.
Although that kind of links to the thing that I was saying about multiple choice, is that when you say both terms, often they can distinguish between them.
Yeah.
It's kind of like asking how tall someone is without someone else there, or looking at, if you ever teach twins, if they're sitting side by side, you can generally tell the difference. But if you've got one by themselves, it's a lot harder. It's the same sort of thing. If you've got one twin, and it's much harder to remember which one it is. Whereas when you hear both side by side, you're like, okay, well, that's that one and that's that one. Any more on that before we move on to finance? No. Okay.